The alarm went off at 6:15. It was the same alarm that had gone off at 6:15 every weekday morning for 11 years, in the same apartment on the same street in the same district of Moscow, and Vera Nikolaevna had long since stopped hearing it as a sound that required conscious response. Her hand found it in the dark. The small plastic alarm clock, Soviet-made, reliable in the way that Soviet objects were sometimes reliable, meaning it either worked completely or it stopped working completely and was replaced, went silent. She lay still for 30 seconds. This was her daily allowance, 30 seconds of the warm dark before the morning became real. She had been allowing herself exactly this since her mother had taught her the trick. Decades ago, 30 seconds, no more. Because more became 10 minutes and 10 minutes became the kind of lateness that Soviet workplaces noted and recorded and eventually mentioned in a way that was not a conversation you wanted to have. Outside the window, Moscow in February was doing what Moscow in February always did. It was dark, it was cold, and there was snow on the ground and more snow in the sky. The temperature would be somewhere around -15°C, about 5 degrees Fahrenheit, which was a reasonable February morning for Moscow, not the brutal cold of the worst winters, but cold enough that the pipes in the older buildings had been doing their particular clanking complaint since November. The pipes in Vera's building were not complaining. Her building was one of the newer panel buildings, the standard Soviet prefabricated concrete apartment blocks that had been going up in Moscow's outer districts since the Khrushchev era, the mass-produced architecture of the Soviet welfare state's most practical and least poetic achievement. The pipes were new enough to still work. She got up. Welcome to Dull Tales. If you've made yourself comfortable, good. We're going somewhere tonight that might feel closer than usual and also farther away than it looks. We're going to Moscow in the 1970s, the Soviet Union at a particular moment in its history, the Brezhnev era, the period that Russians sometimes call the Zastoi, the stagnation, not the terror of the Stalin years, not the reforming energy of Khrushchev. Something else, a long plateau of organized daily life in a country where the ideology said one thing and the reality said another, and most people had worked out, quietly and without announcement, how to live in the gap between them. We're not going to the Kremlin. We're not going to the KGB or the generals or the people who made the decisions. We're going to an apartment in the Cheryomushki district, southwest of the center, in one of the concrete panel buildings that housed the new Moscow middle class. The engineers and teachers and factory workers and researchers who were the Soviet system's intended beneficiaries, and who lived lives of considerable ingenuity in the space between the official version and the actual one. We'll spend time with Vera, who is 44 years old and teaches mathematics at the local school, and who is currently standing in her kitchen making tea in the pre-dawn dark. We'll spend time with her husband Konstantin, an engineer at a research institute who has opinions about everything and who expresses them carefully to people he trusts. We'll spend time with their daughter Masha, 19, a university student who is at this moment asleep in her room and who will wake up with strong opinions about the day. And we'll spend time with their neighbor Pyotr Ivanovich, who is 68 and has seen things that he does not discuss, and who grows tomatoes on his balcony in defiance of several of Moscow's informal but real prohibitions. Leave a comment. Tell me where you're listening from. Tell me if any of this sounds familiar. Subscribe if this is where you want to spend your evenings. Now, back to Vera and the kitchen, and the kettle that takes 4 minutes to boil if you fill it correctly. The kitchen was small. This was not unusual. In the Soviet panel apartment, the Khrushchevka, or the slightly larger Brezhnevka that had replaced it in the newer buildings, the kitchen was not a room for cooking in the Western sense. It was a room for the minimum required cooking, the minimum required storage, and a remarkable amount of the social and private life that a family required. Every Soviet apartment had its kitchen conversations, the late-night discussions that happened at the small kitchen table with the door closed, in the room most distant from the front door, where the words were quietest. The kitchen of Vera and Konstantin's apartment was approximately 8 square meters. It contained a small stove, a small refrigerator, a small table with 2 chairs, a wooden cabinet for the dishes, and the window that looked out over the courtyard. The courtyard at 6:30 in the morning was dark and white, the sodium lamp on the corner illuminating the snow in its orange half-light, the usual Moscow winter morning light. She made tea. The tea ritual in a Soviet kitchen was specific. The electric kettle, the teapot warmed first with a splash of boiling water, the tea, Indian tea, the preferred variety, which came in the distinctive orange and black packaging that was one of the constants of Soviet daily life, spooned in at the correct proportion, the boiling water poured, the weight. While the tea drew, she cut bread. Dark bread, the heavy dark rye bread that was the daily bread of the Soviet table, not the white bread that was also available but that the serious consumer of bread understood to be inferior in every way except price. Butter from the block in the refrigerator. The morning preparation was quick and practiced and sufficient. She drank the first cup alone. This was also the daily allowance. The first cup alone, before the apartment was fully awake, before the day's obligations began. She sat at the small table and looked at the courtyard in the sodium light, and thought about the lesson she had to give third period and the parent meeting at 4 o'clock, and the items that needed to be acquired this week, the particular logistics of Soviet daily provision that organized a significant portion of her mental life. The provision of daily necessities in the Soviet Union in the 1970s was an achievement, not the achievement that the official press described, in which the workers of the Soviet state lived in conditions of increasing abundance, and the superiority of the socialist system over the capitalist was demonstrated daily. The other achievement, the achievement of the person who navigates a system of scarcity with sufficient skill and network and knowledge to keep the household supplied. The shops existed. This is important to say, because the popular Western image of the Soviet Union in this period was sometimes of a country in which goods were simply not there, the empty shelves, the endless queues, the total absence. The reality was more specific and more complicated. Some goods were available easily, some were available with effort, some were available only through connections or the black market, and some were genuinely not available, and knowing which was which and how to get what you needed was one of the primary skills of Soviet daily life. Bread was available. Milk was usually available. The basics of the Soviet diet, the rye bread, the potatoes, the kasha, the pickled vegetables, the salt fish, were available reliably in the state stores. Meat was more variable. The lines at the meat counter on the days when good meat arrived were something you either joined immediately, regardless of what else you were planning to do, or you came back later to whatever was left. Imported goods, citrus fruits in winter, certain coffees, Western consumer goods, ranged from expensive and available to available only if you knew someone to simply not available without the right currency or the right connection. The currency that organized this parallel economy was called Blat, the Russian word for the network of informal connections and exchanges that operated alongside the official economy. Blat was not exactly corruption, though it shaded into corruption. It was the social technology of a shortage economy. You had what you had, and your neighbor had what she had, and the teacher at your daughter's school had what she had, and the system by which these things moved between people was Blat. You did a favor and it was remembered. You were known as someone who could be relied on, and this reliability was itself a form of currency. Vera's Blat network was, after 20 years of adulthood in Moscow, considerable. She knew the woman at the vegetable store who would set aside the good tomatoes. She knew the man at the meat department of the Gastronom who was more reliably supplied on Thursdays. She knew the colleague at school whose brother worked at a furniture factory and who could get access to the waiting lists that organized the purchase of major household goods. This knowledge was not unusual. Every Soviet adult had a version of it. The network was the life. Konstantin got up at 6:45. He was 51, a large, slow-moving man in the morning who became precise and quick in the context of his work, the way that some people are organized around their professional selves in a manner that makes them seem like different people at different times of day. In the kitchen, at 6:45 in February, he was simply a large man in a robe who needed coffee, not the tea that Vera made, but the dense, dark coffee that he had been making since a colleague at the Institute had shown him the Turkish method, which was not officially Turkish, but was understood as such. He made the coffee in a small copper pot on the stove. He did not discuss the Turkish method with anyone at the Institute. The Institute had its particular cultural sensitivities, and in 1975, the year in the middle of the decade that we are inhabiting, the word Turkish carried associations that made discretion appropriate. He sat at the table with his coffee, and Vera moved around him with the efficiency of a woman who has shared a small kitchen with the same man for 22 years, and whose movements around his settled presence were as automatic as the movements around any piece of furniture. They talked about the day, about Masha, who was supposed to call about the university schedule and had not called, about the neighbor, Pyotr Ivanovich, who had been making noise on the balcony yesterday, presumably adjusting the infrastructure of his balcony vegetable operation for some February purpose that they could not quite imagine. What does he grow in February? Konstantin asked. Seeds, said Vera. He starts seeds in February. Konstantin considered this. In February, he said. He's very organized, said Vera. The commute was the daily ordeal. Moscow's metro system, the famous Moscow Metro, the deep underground railway whose stations were one of the Soviet Union's genuine architectural achievements, the marble-floored, chandelier-lit palace stations of the Stalin era, was the city's arterial system. It moved people at the rate of 8 to 9 million trips per day, which made it one of the busiest metro systems in the world, which meant that at 7:30 in the morning the cars were full in the specific way that Moscow metro cars were full. Packed, standing, the coats and scarves and breath of a February rush hour creating a particular warmth that was the warmth of bodies and not of heating. Vera's commute was 40 minutes. 3 stops on the metro to Belyayevo, then a bus to the school that took another 15 minutes in good traffic. In bad traffic, and traffic on a February morning in Moscow was never good in the way that traffic engineers define good. The bus took 25 minutes. She left the apartment at 7:15. The walk to the metro station was 5 minutes. 5 minutes in February in Moscow was a serious 5 minutes. The cold that had been mild and manageable inside the building became real on the street, the kind of cold that made your breath visible immediately, and that required the specific preparation of scarf pulled up, hat pulled down, the face reduced to the minimum necessary exposure. Moscow in winter dressed people in layers, and the layers were not optional. She had been making this walk for 11 years. She knew its texture, the specific creak of the snow underfoot in certain temperatures, the patch of ice outside the bread shop that formed whenever the temperature went above 0, and then refroze, the particular wind that came around the corner of the larger building and hit you in the face regardless of which direction the general wind was coming from, the sodium lamp that had been out for 3 weeks and that she had reported to the housing management office, and that remained out, presumably awaiting the arrival of a particular type of bulb, whose supply chain was experiencing its own particular Soviet delay. The Moscow metro was beautiful. This is not a political statement, it is an aesthetic one. Whatever one thought about the Soviet system, and Vera's thoughts on this subject were complex and carefully contained, the metro stations of the Stalin era were beautiful in a specific way. The marble floors, the vaulted ceilings, the chandeliers, the mosaics. The station at Park Cultury had its celebrated panels depicting Soviet citizens at leisure, the skater, the reader, the dancer, the idealized images of the ideal socialist life. The station at Mayakovskaya had its famous mosaic ceiling panels depicting Soviet aviation. The station at Kievskaya had its murals of Ukrainian life. Each station was different. Each was designed by architects who had been given a mandate to make the underground beautiful, to give the workers of the Soviet state a palace beneath their feet, and who had executed this mandate with a seriousness that the results demonstrate. Vera moved through the stations with the practiced unconsciousness of someone who has stopped seeing what she passes every day. She read on the metro. She always read on the metro. The book this week was a novel that had been lent to her by a colleague, a Soviet novel, not one of the officially disapproved variety, though at the margins of what was entirely comfortable, and she had 40 minutes each way to give to it. The car was warm from the bodies. She stood with her book angled to the light and read, while Moscow moved past in the dark outside the windows. The school day began at 8:30. The school where Vera taught mathematics was a standard Soviet secondary school, the 10-year school, the system that took children from first grade through 10th, that produced the graduates who went on to the universities and the technical institutes and the factories and the collective farms and the army. The curriculum was standardized. The textbooks were standardized. The pedagogical methods were substantially standardized. The Soviet educational system was, in many respects, highly effective at the core academic disciplines, mathematics, physics, chemistry, literature, and organized with the efficiency of a system that had decided what needed to be taught and had the institutional capacity to teach it. Vera taught 9th and 10th grade mathematics. She was, by the consensus of her colleagues and the testimony of the students who came back years later to tell her so, a good teacher. Not the best teacher they had ever had. There was an older man at the school, a physics teacher named Viktor Alexeyevich, who was universally agreed to be extraordinary, and who had the particular ability to make students feel that understanding physics was the most important thing they could do with their time. Vera was not extraordinary in that way. She was reliable, precise, fair, and most importantly, she could explain the thing 3 different ways, and the third way almost always worked for the student for whom the first 2 had not. This is a gift. It is not the glamorous gift, but it is the gift that makes a school function, and most schools run on it. The first class of the morning was 9th grade, the algebra unit that they had been working through since October. She stood at the board with the chalk, Soviet chalk, which had its own particular quality, leaving a line that was consistently too thick for the small notation of mathematics but adequate for the large notation, and worked through the problem set. 14-year-olds watched her, with varying degrees of attention. The 3 in the front were genuinely interested. The 4 in the middle were managing. The 2 in the back right corner were having a conversation that they considered invisible. She knew all of this. She did not pause. Masha woke up at 9. She was 19 and in her second year at Moscow State University, studying history, which her father had approved and her mother had approved, while adding the private observation that history was a field in which knowing which direction the current was running was particularly important. Vera had not said this to Masha. She had said it to Konstantin in the kitchen, with the door closed. Masha was not naive about the Soviet system. She had grown up in the apartment where the kitchen door was closed for certain conversations, and she was not a child who had not understood why. She was, however, at the age at which the gap between the official version and the actual version had become personally interesting rather than simply background, the age at which the system became a subject rather than simply a condition. She was careful. She had her parents' instinct for this, which was the good instinct, the one that distinguished the useful dissatisfaction from the kind that got people into situations that she had heard about in their careful, closed kitchen door way. She made tea and ate bread with butter, and thought about the seminar this afternoon, where the question of the historical role of the peasant commune was going to be discussed by a professor, whose actual opinions on the subject were not identical to his stated opinions, and where the students who understood the gap would perform the appropriate understanding, and the students who did not would either say something wrong or say nothing at all. Masha would say something calibrated. She was good at calibrated. It was a skill she had been developing since she was 12. The communalka, the communal apartment, was not Vera's situation. She and Konstantin had a separate apartment, which was a genuine privilege of their specific positions and the timing of their lives. The housing allocation that had come when Konstantin's institute had sponsored them for the Moscow apartment registry in the early 1960s, and the years of waiting that had preceded it, and the three-room apartment that had been their reward. 3 rooms: the bedroom, Masha's room, and the living room that also served as the study. But the communalka was the experience of millions of Muscovites. The communal apartment in which several families shared a single apartment's kitchen and bathroom, with one family or couple per room, the lives of strangers in permanent, intimate proximity. The communalka had been a feature of Moscow life since the revolutionary period, when the housing stock of the pre-revolutionary bourgeoisie was divided among the working population, and it had persisted through the housing-building campaigns of the Soviet era because the housing stock, however rapidly it was built, never quite caught up with the demand. Pyotr Ivanovich had lived in a communalka for 20 years before finally being allocated his own apartment in this building. He had arrived in this building the same year as Vera and Konstantin, and in 11 years of being neighbors they had developed the specific relationship of Soviet apartment building residents. Not friends, exactly, but something more than acquaintances, a relationship of mutual awareness and occasional mutual assistance that was part of the social fabric of the building. He was 68. He had been born before the revolution. He remembered things that he did not discuss, because the people who had discussed similar things in the years when he was young had sometimes subsequently disappeared. He grew tomatoes on his balcony. He tended them with a seriousness that suggested the tomatoes were important to him in a way that went beyond the tomatoes. When Vera brought him a jar of her pickled cucumbers in September, he received them with a formality that she recognized as genuine feeling managed through the Soviet man's mechanism of understatement. "Thank you, Vera Nikolaevna," he said. "Most welcome, Pyotr Ivanovich," she said. They did not embrace. This was fine. They understood each other. The Gastronom was on the ground floor of the building at the corner of the next block. The Gastronom, the Soviet food store, the combination grocery and delicatessen that was the primary food retail institution of the Soviet city, was the place where the daily provision happened, and the daily provision was one of the organizing activities of Soviet domestic life. You went to the Gastronom regularly. You went when you were passing. You went when someone told you that something had come in. You went with a shopping bag, the string bag, the Avoska, the name of which meant approximately just in case, because you carried it just in case you found something worth buying. The Avoska was one of the defining objects of Soviet daily life, the string bag that could expand to hold anything and compress to nothing in the pocket. The material expression of the Soviet consumer's relationship with the supply system, always ready, never certain what would be there. Vera's Avoska was in her coat pocket every day. She used it most days. She had been using one since childhood. She would use one for the rest of her life. The Gastronom had sections: the bread section, the dairy section, the meat section, the vegetables, the deli counter. Each section had its queue. The queue was not a failure of the system. The queue was the system, the mechanism by which scarce goods were distributed on the basis of time and patience rather than money alone. You were not richer for having more money if there was not more product. You were better supplied for having more time, which is a different kind of inequality, and the Soviet system's particular contribution to the history of consumer inconvenience. On the day in question, there were sausages. This information arrived at Vera's school at 11 in the morning through the specific information network of Soviet daily life, which was word of mouth, which was faster and more reliable than any official channel for this type of news. A teacher whose husband worked near the Gastronom had called. The sausages had come in. The good ones. There would be a queue. Vera reorganized her afternoon. The queue was, in the Soviet experience, an institution, not just a practical arrangement for distributing scarce goods. An institution, with its own customs and rules and social structures, the way that all long-standing human arrangements develop customs and rules. You did not simply join the queue. You ascertained the queue's status, how long it was, how fast it was moving, what was at the end of it, whether the supply would last until you reached the counter. You established your position with the person in front of you and the person behind you because the Soviet queue was a social relationship as well as a linear arrangement. Who's last? Was the standard question. I am was the standard answer. You were admitted into the queue's social order. You waited. The waiting in the queue was not wasted time exactly. It was the time in which the information network operated, the news that was exchanged in a standing group of people who had nowhere else to be. Who had what? Where it had come in? What was available at the market on Saturday? The gossip of the neighborhood and the building and the school. The larger news that everyone had heard but that had not appeared in the newspaper. The newspaper, Pravda, Izvestia, did not publish the news in the Western sense. It published what the state decided the population should know, which was a careful selection of reality organized around the interests of the state. Everybody knew this. The jokes about it were one of the most robust genres of Soviet humor. There is no truth in Pravda and no news in Izvestia. The pun on Pravda, truth, and Izvestia, news, being one of the permanent fixtures of Soviet wit. The actual news moved through the queues and the kitchens and the apartments, in conversations that were calibrated to the level of trust between the speakers and the seriousness of the topic. Pyotr Ivanovich's balcony faced south. This was the fact around which his entire vegetable operation was organized. South-facing in Moscow meant maximum winter sun, which in February meant perhaps 4 hours of direct light on a clear day, which was enough for the seed-starting operation that he had developed over 10 years of balcony horticulture. The seeds this year were his own, saved from last year's tomatoes, dried and stored through the winter in labeled envelopes in the drawer of his desk. He had developed over the decade of this practice something that might be described as a philosophy of the seed, not in the sense of a system of thought, in the sense of a conviction that the capacity of a dried seed to become, with nothing more than water and light and time, the full living reality of the planet contained was evidence of something. He did not name what it was evidence of. He had stopped trying to name things when naming things had become inadvisable, and he had never quite resumed. He started the seeds in trays of soil on the balcony table, covered with plastic sheeting against the cold, facing the weak February sun. He went out to check them morning and evening. The seeds had not yet germinated. It was still too early, but he checked anyway because the checking was part of the practice. The attention paid to something fragile was its own argument for the thing's importance. He had seen the Stalinist terror as a young man. He had seen the war. He had seen the death of Stalin and the Khrushchev thaw and the slow freezing that followed. He was growing tomatoes. This was not resignation. It was the knowledge, specific and hard-earned, of what a person could do in conditions they did not control. You grew what you could grow. You tended what you had. You waited for the spring. The apartment building itself was a character. 9 stories, prefabricated concrete panels, built in 1968, the exterior the gray-cream color that was the default aesthetic of the Soviet panel building. Not the gray of neglect, but the gray of the specific concrete mix that the standard Soviet panel building specification required, which had that color when new and retained it, more or less, for the building's life. The building contained 64 apartments. 180 people lived in it, approximately, the count being complicated by the unofficial residents. The students staying with relatives, the provincial relatives visiting for longer than the residence permit technically permitted, the few cases of multiple families crammed into a single apartment while waiting for an allocation that had been promised but not yet materialized. The building had a courtyard, the typical Soviet residential courtyard, enclosed on 3 sides, with a small playground at one end and wooden benches near the playground where the older residents sat in summer and where, in winter, nobody sat. In summer, the courtyard was a social space. The children playing, the older women on the benches exchanging the information that organized neighborhood life, the occasional appearance of a drunk who was managed with varying degrees of patience by whoever was closest. In February, the courtyard was simply the space between the building and the street, traversed quickly. Vera knew which of her neighbors to nod to and which to actively avoid. The building, like all Soviet apartment buildings, had its informant, the person who kept the housing management committee abreast of unusual activity and unusual guests. Everyone knew who it was, though the knowledge was never acknowledged aloud, because acknowledging it would have been impolite in a way that Soviet social life required you to navigate with care. You were civil. You were not confiding. The school canteen served lunch at 12:30. This was the meal that the Soviet state provided to its schoolchildren as a matter of policy, the hot lunch that was a benefit of the Soviet educational system, and that was, in the mid-1970s, considerably better than it would become in the difficult years of the late 1980s. The menu at Vera's school was simple: a soup course, borscht today, which meant the beetroot soup that was one of the great constants of Soviet and Russian cuisine, dense, deeply colored, served with a spoonful of smetana, the sour cream that was the standard accompaniment, followed by a main course of meat or fish, potatoes in some form, and compote for dessert, the stewed fruit drink that was the Soviet lunch's standard closing. Vera ate in the teacher's room with the other teachers, the parallel institution to the students' canteen, slightly better appointed and slightly quieter. She ate with her colleague Nina Petrovna, who taught Russian literature, and who was one of the few people in Vera's daily life with whom she talked about things that were not entirely managed. Nina was 57, a widow, a reader of everything, a person of very specific and consistently expressed opinions, who had somehow navigated the Soviet system's preference for the unspecific and unexpressed by the strategy of being specific about the past and impressionistic about the present. She talked about the 19th century Russian writers with a directness and a passion that no one found alarming, because the 19th century was safe. She talked about the 20th century with considerably more care. The new Trifonov, Nina said, meaning the new novel by Yuri Trifonov, the writer of Moscow Stories who had become one of the most widely read serious writers of the Soviet 1970s, the writer who could describe the specific texture of Moscow apartment life with a precision that his readers found both recognizing and slightly uncomfortable. Have you read it? I'm reading it, said Vera. I'm on the Metro chapter. Nina nodded. The Metro chapter, she said. They ate their borscht. The Metro chapter was understood. The Soviet Union in the 1970s was not the Soviet Union of the purges. This distinction mattered enormously to the people living in it. The terror had been real. The gulag had been real. The arbitrary arrests and the disappeared and the executed had been real, and the memory of them was not abstract. It lived in specific families, in specific names that were not mentioned, in the careful way of speaking that had developed in the Stalin years and that had never entirely left the generation that had lived through them. Pyotr Ivanovich had known people who did not come back. He had been a young engineer when it was happening. He had kept his head down. He had survived. The Brezhnev era was not the Stalin era. The fear was different, not the existential terror of the worst years, but the lower frequency anxiety of a system that still had power over your career, your housing allocation, your children's university prospects, your ability to travel. The control was less violent. It was also more pervasive in some ways, more woven into the fabric of daily life, more present in the small decisions of what to say and what not to say and to whom. The Soviet citizen of the 1970s had developed, through decades of this negotiation, a kind of social fluency in what the system required. You joined the right organizations. You attended the required meetings. You express the required opinions in the required contexts. And in the private contexts, the kitchen, the apartment, the conversation with people you genuinely trusted, you were, often, something else. Not a dissident. Most Soviet citizens were not dissidents. The actual dissidents were a small, brave, and mostly isolated group who paid serious prices for their public expression. Most people were something more nuanced than dissident. People who maintained a private self that was not identical to the public self, who had organized their inner life in a way that the system could not entirely reach, who had found, in the space of the kitchen and the trusted friend and the book from the circulating Samizdat, something that was theirs. Samizdat. The word means self-publishing, the practice of reproducing banned or semi-banned texts by hand or typewriter, passing them from reader to reader in the specific informal network that was Soviet literary culture's underground. You received a typescript. You read it. You copied it or you passed it on. The text moved through the network in deteriorating copies, increasingly hard to read, the typescript faint on the carbon paper that produced the sixth or seventh copy. You did not keep it. You read it and moved it on. What moved through the Samizdat was varied. Some of it was serious political writing, the essays of Solzhenitsyn, the memoirs of the Gulag survivors. Some of it was literary poetry that was not publishable in the official press, the early prose of writers who had not yet been published or who could not be. Some of it was simply good writing that existed in a gray area, not prohibited exactly, but not available through the official bookstore. The official bookstores were not empty. The Soviet Union was a literate country, and the publishing system produced books at a rate that would impress any comparison. The problem was not the quantity but the selection. What was published was what the system permitted, and the gap between what the system permitted and what readers wanted was where the Samizdat operated. Vera had read things she had not come by through official channels. She did not discuss this. This was understood. Konstantin's institute was one of the Moscow scientific research institutes that were the backbone of the Soviet technical and scientific project. The Soviet Union had made significant investments in science and engineering since the 1920s. The technical intelligentsia were a valued class, well paid by Soviet standards, given good apartments and access to the closed stores that served the upper tiers of the Soviet system. The institute where Konstantin worked was one of the better ones. It had a library. It had reasonably current journals. It had the equipment for the work. It had colleagues of genuine quality. It also had the party organization, the required meetings, the reports, the assessment of the ideological reliability of its members, the careful management of who was allowed to attend international conferences and who was not. Konstantin attended the required meetings. He gave the required assessments. He did his actual work, which was good work, and which he was allowed to do because the system needed people who could do it, and he was one of them. He had opinions about the system that he kept in the kitchen. He kept them there because he had a daughter at university and a wife who taught school, and an apartment that he had waited years for, and these things were worth protecting with the specific care that the Soviet professional of his generation had learned to apply to the boundaries between what you thought and what you said. He was not cowardly. He was prudent. The distinction mattered to him, and he had spent considerable time over the years maintaining it in his own assessment of himself. He walked to the metro in the morning with the other engineers from the building. There were 3 of them who worked in the same general direction, who had fallen into a morning companionship of pure proximity. They talked about safe things, the football results, the weather, the metro delays. They did not talk about the things they thought about. They understood each other perfectly. The banya was on Saturdays. The bathhouse, the Russian banya, the steam bath, was a weekly institution for Konstantin and his colleague Sergei, the physicist from the institute who lived in the next building and who had proposed the Saturday banya practice 8 years ago, and who had been keeping it going ever since. They went to a public banya in the next district, not the elegant private banyas that existed for those with the right connections, but the solid, reliable public banya with its steam room and its cold plunge and its wooden benches and its smell of wet birch and soap. The banya was, for Russian men of this generation, a social institution of a particular kind. Not the coffee house, not the bar in the Western sense. The banya, with its combination of physical discomfort and sensory pleasure, with its specific social ritual of the birch venik, the bound bundle of birch branches that you beat each other with, in the steam, to open the pores and improve the circulation, was the place where certain conversations happened that did not happen elsewhere. The steam loosened things. The absence of outside clothing, no ranks, no official positions visible, flattened the social hierarchy in a way that was both literal and functional. You talked more honestly in the banya. This was understood. This was why people went. Konstantin and Sergei had been talking honestly in the banya for 8 years. Not dangerously honestly, but honestly, about the work, about the system, about the direction of things, about what their children were going to inherit, about the tomatoes that Pyotr Ivanovich grew on his balcony, which had become a symbol in their conversation for something they could not quite name, but recognized when they saw it. The television was Soviet. This sounds obvious. But the television in the Soviet apartment of the 1970s was the Soviet television set, the black and white or, increasingly, color television manufactured in the Soviet Union, with its particular reliability characteristics and its fixed channels of central television. Central television broadcast 2 channels. Channel 1, which was the main channel with the news and the official programming, and Channel 2, which was the second channel with the culture and the education. The news was read by anchors in suits, at desks, with the grave seriousness of people delivering information that the state considered important for the population to have. The information was selected. The framing was considered. The picture of the Soviet Union that the news presented was a picture of a country of achievement and stability and correct foreign policy and the ongoing success of the socialist project. Vera and Konstantin watched the news. Not because they believed it, or not because they believed all of it. They watched it for what it was doing, the specific choices of what to show and what not to show, the emphasis, the language, the omission. Reading Soviet television was a skill, like reading the Samizdat was a skill, like all the skills of navigating the gap between the official version and the actual one. Masha watched the news with them when she was home and made her calibrated observations in the living room in a way that was different from the kitchen, in the way that everything was slightly different from the kitchen. After the news, a film, sometimes a Soviet film, the rich tradition of Soviet cinema that included genuine masterworks, Tarkovsky, Eisenstein, the less openly ideological current that ran through Soviet cinema when the directors had room to breathe. Sometimes a foreign film from a socialist country, Hungarian, Polish, Czech. Sometimes something imported from further abroad, dubbed into Russian, arriving with the particular quality of distance that dubbed films have. They watched. They were not passive. The watching was active. This too was a skill. Masha came home at 7. She came in with the cold air of the February evening still on her coat, which she hung at the door, and the particular energy of a 19-year-old who had been somewhere interesting and needed to tell someone. She told Vera in the kitchen, while Vera was finishing the dinner preparation. She told her about the seminar, the professor, the discussion, the student who had said something that Masha described as genuinely brave, which means also possibly not smart. Vera listened. She did not offer the editorial comment that she was framing in her head. She offered instead, "What did you think of the historiography?" Masha told her what she thought of the historiography. This was the family's communication style, the conversation that was about the surface topic and also about the real topic, simultaneously, conducted in the kitchen over the dinner preparation in the specific way of families that have developed their own language for the things they can't quite say. "You look tired," Vera said. "I'm fine," said Masha. "Eat something." These were not the real sentences. The real sentences had been said. Both of them knew this. Dinner was at 8. The dinner in a Soviet apartment of this period was the main meal of the day, not the European model of the heavy midday meal, but the Soviet adaptation that had shifted the substantial eating to the evening, because the workday and the school day made midday cooking impractical. Vera's dinner was solid and specific. The soup that she had made on Sunday and that had been improving all week in the refrigerator. The main dish that she had planned to be quick because Tuesday evenings were long. Potatoes, always potatoes, the bedrock of Russian cooking. The reliable carbohydrate that appeared in some form at most Soviet meals. Boiled, fried, mashed in soups as a side dish. The sausages that she had secured that afternoon cut and pan-fried with onion. Dark bread. Pickled cucumbers from her own September batch. The great autumn pickling that was one of the central activities of the Soviet domestic year. The preservation of summer's vegetables for winter's table. The rows of glass jars in the pantry that were both practical and a kind of private abundance. Tea afterward. They ate together, all three of them on the nights when Masha was home. This was not required. It was chosen, maintained by the small effort that family meals require when the family's members are busy people with their own schedules. The maintenance was Vera's mostly, in the way that the maintenance of family rituals often is. She did not resent this. She had decided at some point in the marriage that the things that mattered required maintenance and that she was willing to provide it. Konstantin told them about the institute, about the problem the team was working on. Not the classified specifics, there were classified specifics, but the general texture of the intellectual puzzle. He described it the way he described problems, with the pleasure of someone who genuinely liked thinking. Masha asked questions, Vera asked fewer. She watched them. She was satisfied by what she saw. After dinner, Vera did the washing up. This was not assigned. It was simply how it went. Konstantin made the coffee, his Turkish method, in the small copper pot and brought it to the living room, and Masha went to her room to read, and Vera washed the dishes. In the kitchen, alone, with the radio on, the radio at this hour was music, not news, and the music was one of the pleasures she had organized around the washing up, the classical radio that played in the background while her hands were in the warm water. She thought about the day, the algebra class, the teacher whose news about the sausages had reorganized her afternoon, the cue, the specific weight of the sausages in the Avoska on the walk home, Nina Petrovna and the Metro chapter, Masha's description of the brave student, the day accumulated in the washing up. Not all of it was good. Not all of it was bad. It was a Tuesday in February in Moscow, and it was what it was, and she had managed it with the competence that she brought to everything, and she would manage tomorrow with the same. This was the word she had come to over the years. Not happiness, which was too large and too intermittent to be the measure. Not satisfaction, which was too small. Competence. The ongoing demonstration to herself that she could manage what was in front of her, that she was adequate to her life. This was enough. This was, in fact, a great deal. The night settled. Pyotr Ivanovich went to check his balcony seeds one more time at 9 o'clock. The plastic sheeting held the cold at bay, barely. The seeds lay in their trays, not yet visible, the potential of them entirely concealed in the dried husks. He stood on the balcony in his coat and looked at the trays and looked at the Moscow sky, which was the orange-purple sky of a city at night, the snow clouds reflecting the city's lights back at itself, the particular non-dark of the Moscow winter night. He went inside. He made himself tea. He sat in his chair. He was not unhappy. He was old and he had seen things and he was still here, and tomorrow the seeds would be one day closer to whatever they were going to become. The building settled around its residents. The heat from the central heating system, the district heating, the Soviet centralized provision that heated entire neighborhoods from a single large boiler, moved through the pipes with its particular clank and hiss. The sound was the building's breathing. The residents who had lived here for years no longer heard it. It was the sound of being warm when it was cold outside. That was enough. Masha fell asleep over her book at 10:30. She had planned to read until midnight. She turned out her light when she woke at 11 and had no memory later of doing so. Konstantin put out his light at 11. He was asleep before Vera came to bed. Vera put out her light at 11:30. She had finished the Trifonov. She thought about it for a moment in the dark, the way it had described the apartment, the kitchen conversations, the gap between the official self and the actual self. She thought, yes, that. The alarm was set for 6:15. Outside, the Moscow winter continued reliably in the way that Moscow winters continue. The snow fell. The temperature held at -15. The city of 9 million people was mostly asleep. The seeds on the balcony were there in their plastic sheeting in the dark, beginning a process that Pyotr Ivanovich would not be able to see for weeks. But the process had started. The warmth in the soil, the minimal February light, the patient biological machine of the seed doing what seeds do. Spring was not close. It was there in the seed, waiting, as it always is, as it always has been. The Moscow of 1975 was a city of contradictions that its residents had long since stopped finding contradictory. It was the capital of a superpower. The nuclear-armed state that had launched the first satellite, had sent the first human into space, that maintained an army of terrifying size, that spoke at the United Nations with the weight of a country that had defeated Nazi Germany and paid for that victory with 27 million dead. It was also a city where you could not reliably buy a good pair of shoes. The shoe problem was one of the canonical Soviet shortage problems, not because shoes did not exist, but because the shoes that existed and the shoes that people wanted were not the same shoes. The Soviet shoe industry produced shoes. It produced them in quantities that should, by the numbers, have been sufficient. The problem was that the shoes it produced were often the shoes that the plan required rather than the shoes that the consumer wanted. The planned economy could measure quantity. It was less good at measuring whether the quantity was what anyone actually needed. The result was a system in which a visit from a foreign diplomat who happened to bring a supply of Western consumer goods, Western jeans, Western shoes, Western electronics, created a social event, because these things represented the gap between what was theoretically sufficient and what was actually desired. The desire was not for the West exactly. It was for quality, for things that worked well and looked good and lasted. Vera owned 2 pairs of shoes that she considered acceptable. They were Czech shoes, Eastern Bloc imports, which were considered superior to the domestic Soviet production, because the Czech industry had retained more of its pre-war expertise. She had owned them for 4 years. She was prepared to own them for 4 more. She did not feel particularly deprived by this. Or rather, she felt the deprivation in specific moments and then moved on, because moving on was what you did, because the alternative was to spend your life in sustained complaint about conditions that were not going to change today or next week. And that kind of sustained complaint was neither useful nor comfortable. The apartment building had a managing committee. Every Soviet apartment building had a managing committee, the Upravdom, the building's official administrator, whose job was the maintenance of the building and the relationship between the building's residents and the housing authority. In practice, the managing committee was a structure that varied enormously by building. In some buildings, it was a functioning organization that managed maintenance requests and organized collective activities and knew who lived where and what they needed. In other buildings, it was the bureaucratic minimum, the form without much of the function. Vera's building was somewhere in the middle. The managing committee met once a month. The meetings were attended by the retirees who had time and the younger residents who had concerns specific enough to make the time. The meetings resolved some things and deferred others in the specific proportion that Soviet administrative bodies tended toward. The sodium lamp that had been out for 3 weeks was on the agenda at the next meeting. Vera had put it there. Not because she expected it to be fixed quickly. The fixing of the sodium lamp required a bulb of the right type, which required a requisition, which required the approval, which required the supply, But because the meeting was the mechanism through which the request moved officially, and moving things officially was the path. The path was slow. The path existed. You used it. The food of the Soviet apartment was the food of a specific tradition. Russian food in the 1970s was not the cuisine that the international hotels served to foreign guests, the version of Russian food that represented the official face of the culture. It was the food of the apartment kitchen, the food of the Sunday dinner when Vera's mother came, and something more substantial was required. The borscht. The thick red soup of beetroot and cabbage and potato, and when available, beef. That was one of the genuine pleasures of Russian cold weather eating. The soup that gets better every day it sits in the refrigerator, the soup that tastes of effort and time. Vera made a large pot on Sundays and it lasted through the week, improving as it went. The kotelty, the Russian meat patties, made with bread soaked in milk mixed into the ground meat, pan-fried in a quantity of oil that would give a modern cardiologist pause. That were one of the standard weeknight dinners. The pelmeni, the Russian dumplings that were a celebration food and a quick food simultaneously, depending on whether you made them yourself, celebration, time-consuming, eaten with smetana and a certain justified pride, or bought them frozen quick, adequate, eaten with the mild guilt of someone who knows what the homemade version is supposed to taste like. The pickles. Always the pickles. The September pickling session, the cucumbers, the tomatoes, the cabbage for the sauerkraut that would last through the winter, was one of the great domestic rituals of Soviet life. Vera pickled 30 jars of cucumbers every September. She had been doing this since she was old enough to help her mother do it. She would be doing it until she could no longer manage the jar lids. The pickled cucumber was not simply a condiment. It was the summer preserved in salt and dill and garlic. A jar of June opened in February. The taste of the kitchen garden in a country house that the family rented for 2 weeks every August. The smell of the late summer evening when the cucumbers were coming in. When you opened a jar in February, you opened the summer. This is not nothing. This is, in fact, quite a lot. The dacha was the Soviet institution that made the rest of it possible. The dacha, the country house, the small plot of land outside the city, was not a luxury in the Soviet Union. It was, for the Moscow middle class, a survival mechanism. The small house or cottage, often in a collective settlement of similar cottages in the forest outside the city, with its garden plot where you grew vegetables and fruit, was the place where the apartment-bound Moscow family was restored. Not all Muscovites had a dacha, but many did, or had access to one through relatives or through collective dacha arrangements, the Soviet adaptation of the Russian tradition of the country house to the realities of a socialist urban population. The dacha culture organized the Moscow year, the anticipation of it through the winter, the opening of it in May, the summer weeks there, the late summer harvest, the closing and winterizing in September, the jars brought back to the city, the produce stored. Vera and Konstantin had access to a dacha through Konstantin's Institute, which had a collective dacha settlement in the forest 40 miles from Moscow. The dachas in the settlement were modest, 2 rooms, a summer kitchen, an outhouse, a garden plot of approximately 30 square meters. The garden plot produced cucumbers and tomatoes and zucchini and dill and parsley in quantities that were a genuine supplement to the household supply. Vera spent the last 2 weeks of August at the dacha every. Konstantin came on weekends when the institute permitted. Masha, as a child, had spent entire summers there. As a university student, she came for 1 week. She came. The dacha was the part of Soviet life that the official descriptions could not quite capture. The official version of the dacha was the reward of the worker's state, the access to nature that the socialist system provided. The actual version was more fundamental. It was the place where you were not in the apparatus, not in the system, not in the managed space of Soviet urban life. You were in the forest. The tomatoes were yours. You had made them. No one had given them to you. This distinction, the small sovereignty of growing your own, was something for which Russian language had the dacha to express. Masha had a question for her history professor that she was working out how to ask. The question was about sources. Specifically, about the sources for the period of collectivization in the early 1930s, the period when Soviet agriculture had been reorganized into collective farms, the period that had involved significant suffering and death in the Ukrainian territories and elsewhere, the period that the official historiography discussed in terms of the overall achievement while being somewhat compressed about the specifics. Her professor was a careful man. He was knowledgeable. He was not naive. He navigated the curriculum with the skill of a person who had been doing this for 20 years and who had found the line between what was teachable and what was not. Masha was trying to find out whether she could ask him about the sources that were not in the official bibliography. She was trying to do this without asking it in a way that made it sound like something other than a scholarly question about historiography, which was what it was, but which in the wrong framing could sound like something more pointed. She was 19. She was good at this. She was her mother's daughter. She decided to ask him after class, not during. She rehearsed the phrasing in her head on the metro. The metro took 40 minutes. She had enough time. The children of the building played in the courtyard on Saturday mornings. There were 8 children between the ages of 5 and 12 who lived in the building's 64 apartments, which was not many by pre-war standards, but which was the specific demographic of the Soviet 1970s urban apartment building. Families were smaller. Apartments were small. The birth rate had been declining since the 1950s. The 8 children played the games that children have always played in courtyards. The improvised games, the games whose rules were established by the oldest and contested by the others, the games that required only the bodies of the participants and the space of the courtyard. In February, in -15, the games were vigorous. The cold required movement. The snow was abundant. Snowball fights, which were universal, and in which the rules about appropriate targeting were continuously negotiated and continuously violated. The ice that had formed at the edge of the courtyard, which served as a small skating surface for those with skates and a sliding surface for those without. Vera watched them from the kitchen window on Saturday mornings. She had stood at this window and watched children play in this courtyard for 11 years. She had watched specific children grow from small people who fell frequently to larger people who did not. She had watched the courtyard's sociology, the alliances and the conflicts and the hierarchies, with the attention of a teacher who had been observing children's social behavior professionally for 20 years. Children were the same everywhere. The courtyard was the courtyard, the snowball was the snowball, the cold was the cold, the laughter was the laughter. The clinic was on the other side of the district. Soviet healthcare was free. This is the fact that needs to be stated first, before the qualifications. The Soviet healthcare system provided universal access to medical care at no cost to the patient. The polyclinic, the local clinic that served a defined neighborhood population, was the entry point into the system. You were registered at your neighborhood polyclinic. You went there for ordinary medical needs. You were referred from there to specialist services. The system was free. The qualifications were also real. The quality varied significantly between what was available in the polyclinic in the outer Moscow district and what was available at the specialized institutes that served the Soviet elite. The equipment in the ordinary polyclinic was often dated. The waiting times were long. The doctors were, many of them, excellent. Soviet medical education was serious. The system produced doctors of genuine quality, but they were operating under conditions of resource constraint that affected what they could do. Vera went to the polyclinic twice a year for the preventive checkup that was part of the Soviet system's genuinely effective preventive medicine program. She waited. She was seen. The doctor was competent. The checkup was brief and functional. She came home. Free medicine was not glamorous. Free medicine was medicine you could go to without calculating whether you could afford it. This was, she knew, not nothing. She had relatives who had emigrated to the West and who described the cost of medical care with a disbelief that she found equally believable. Different systems, different problems. She was here. This system was hers. The library was her second place. After the school, after the apartment, the library. Not the school library, though she used that too. The neighborhood library, in the building next to the metro. The public lending library that was one of the Soviet system's genuine achievements. The network of lending libraries that gave the entire Soviet population access to books in quantities that Western countries with their expensive bookshops often did not match. The Soviet Union published books, enormous quantities. The classics, the Russian classics, the world classics in translation, were published in print runs of hundreds of thousands. The literary magazines that published contemporary fiction and poetry, Novi Mir, Yunost, Oktyabr, had circulation numbers that literary publications in other countries could not imagine. The Soviet reading public was genuinely large and genuinely serious, and the library system served it. Vera held 2 library cards, her own and Masha's, which Masha had handed over at 16 with the observation that she was too busy to use it, but that Vera would find it useful. She did find it useful. The doubled card capacity allowed her to have in progress simultaneously the things she was reading for herself, and the things she was reading in order to have read them. The distinction that all serious readers know between reading and reading. She went to the library on Thursday evenings after the parent meetings that seemed always to fall on Thursdays. She stayed for 40 minutes, she browsed, she returned, she borrowed, she walked home. This was hers, not managed, not reported, not assessed. 40 minutes in the stacks and then home in the dark with books under her arm. Hers. Konstantin had a desk drawer. This is a small thing, but in the Soviet apartment, where space was organized with the precision of a submarine, every drawer was managed, and the desk drawer that was specifically Konstantin's, that was not rummaged through by Vera or Masha, that held the things that were specifically his, was a domestic sovereignty. In the drawer, his engineering notebooks from the early years of the Institute, the calculations in his small, precise handwriting. A photograph of his father, who had died in the war. A letter from a colleague who had immigrated and whose name he no longer spoke aloud. The German engineering journal that he received through the Institute's library system, which he read in the evenings with the dictionary beside him, because German was the language of the engineering tradition he had been trained in and he had maintained it through reading. A small notebook in which he had written, over the years, the things that he was thinking about and was not saying aloud. The notebook was not incriminating. He was not a fool. It was a record of technical problems and professional frustrations and the occasional observation about a colleague and, very rarely, something more personal. It was his. It was where he thought when thinking in his head was not enough. He would not have described himself as a man who kept a journal. He would have described the notebook as a working document. This was accurate and also not the whole truth. The Trifonov novel that Vera was reading was called The House on the Embankment. It was in some ways a novel about this life, about the Moscow apartment, the system, the private self and the public self, the specific compromises of the Soviet-educated class. Trifonov wrote about these things with a precision that his readers found both consoling and uncomfortable. Consoling because it said, yes, this is real, this is happening, you are not alone in it. Uncomfortable because the precision meant that you could not look away from the specific shape of the thing. She read it on the metro and at the kitchen table after Konstantin was asleep and in the 40 minutes before the alarm on the mornings when she woke early. She thought about it. She talked about it with Nina Petrovna. She recommended it to her neighbor, who was not a reader, and then thought better of the recommendation and said nothing. The novel was about the price of accommodation. About the specific forms of cowardice and the specific forms of survival and whether these were distinguishable and what it cost you to find out. Vera thought about this. She had her conclusions. She kept them in the kitchen. The Sunday lunch was the week's ceremony. Every Sunday, Vera's mother came. Vera's mother, Natalia Ivanovna, was 71, a retired librarian, a woman of ferocious opinions and considerable charm, who walked across Moscow when the weather was acceptable and took the metro when it was not, who arrived at noon and left at 4, who ate what was put in front of her and commented on it with the frankness of someone who had been feeding this family for 40 years and considered her opinion on its food a matter of established right. The cabbage is under season, she might say. The cabbage is fine, Vera might say. It's fine, Konstantin might confirm, which was the most he would say. Your father liked more caraway, her mother might observe. This conversation or variations of it had been happening for 22 years. It was not a conflict. It was a ritual. The form of it, the slight criticism, the slight defense, the citation of the father who had been dead for 15 years, was the expression of something that had no other form, the continuing relationship between the woman and her daughter, the transmission of the specific flavor of a family. The Sunday lunch was also the occasion for information exchange. Natalia Ivanovna knew things. She had been a librarian for 30 years and she had the librarian's network, the knowledge of what was available and what was circulating and who had what and what had recently come in and what was being talked about. She was, in the information ecology of Soviet Moscow, well positioned. After lunch, they drank tea. Masha, when she was home, sat with them and was quiet in the way that you are quiet when the conversation is between people older than you who are communicating things that the surface of the conversation only partially represents. She was learning something. She was not entirely sure what. She suspected it would become clear later. The radio was on in the kitchen from 6:15 until 7:15 every morning. This was the specific morning program. The Soviet morning radio broadcast that mixed music and news and the kind of upbeat, productivity-oriented content that the Soviet media considered appropriate for the morning hours. The music was good. Soviet popular music of the 1970s was, in its way, genuinely good. The estrada tradition of Soviet pop music, the big orchestrations and the clear voices, the songs that became the soundtrack of the era in the way that certain songs always become the soundtrack of their era. The news was managed. The upbeat content was the upbeat content. Vera did not listen to the news on the morning radio. She half listened to the music. The music was the morning's company while the tea was brewing and the bread was being cut and the day was assembling itself. She had also, through a neighbor who had the equipment, heard Western radio. Voice of America, Radio Liberty, the American-funded station that broadcast in Russian. Not regularly, the reception was jammed, the jamming imperfect, the signal coming through in fragments, but enough to understand that the information on the other side of the jamming was different from the information on the inside. This was not a revelation. It confirmed what she already understood. The understanding was useful. The radio was not safe. She did not pursue it. The child who lived upstairs was learning the piano. This was a feature of Soviet apartment life that was both admirable and difficult. The Soviet system placed high value on musical education. It was part of the general cultural ambition of the Soviet project, the creation of a culturally elevated working class. The music schools took students from elementary age and produced, over the decades, a population with musical literacy that was high by international standards. The music schools also produced, in every apartment building, the sound of piano practice from the apartments of the families who owned or rented pianos. The child upstairs was working on a Cherny etude. Cherny etude number 50, which Vera recognized because she had played it herself at the same age, in the same Moscow music school system, before deciding that mathematics was more her natural domain and redirecting accordingly. The child was on the difficult section. She heard it every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon. The same section, slightly different each time, the improvement gradual and then sudden, the way improvement works. She did not find it annoying. She found it, if she was honest, slightly moving. The sound of a child doing the difficult patient work of learning something hard, the Tuesday and Thursday repetitions, the section that resisted, the gradual coming right. This was the most familiar thing in the world. This was what she did every day at the blackboard with the 9th grade. The different framing, mathematics, not music, but the same fundamental transaction. The knowledge resisting the repetition, the gradual coming right. Pyotr Ivanovich had been an engineer. This is not surprising in the Soviet context. Engineering was one of the highest status professions in the Soviet system. The technical intelligentsia were valued and reasonably well compensated, and the country's industrialization had required engineers in large numbers. He had worked in the construction sector, in the post-war period when Moscow was being rebuilt and expanded, when the housing that the city needed was going up in the districts that were becoming the suburbs. He had been good at his work. He had supervised the construction of buildings that were still standing. Some of them were the buildings of the district where he now lived, the buildings he had built and then retired to be surrounded by, which was a kind of completion that he appreciated without sentimentality. He had retired at 65. He had not wanted to retire. The Institute had been polite about it. He understood. Now he grew tomatoes, not because tomatoes were his passion. He was not, before the retirement, a gardening person. He had grown them the first year because he had the time and the south-facing balcony and a friend who gave him seedlings. He had grown them the second year because the first year's tomatoes had been, honestly, extraordinary, the specific flavor of a tomato grown in direct sunlight in a Moscow summer, warm on the vine when you picked it, nothing like the tomatoes in the Gastronom. By the third year he understood that the tomatoes were not the point, or the tomatoes were the point, but the tomatoes were also a structure for days. The daily check, the watering, the staking as they grew, the watching for the small signs of disease or pest or difficulty, the problem-solving when something went wrong, the anticipation of the harvest. This was what work had given him and what retirement had taken away, not the outcome but the structure, the organized attention to something that required it, the days organized by the problem. The tomatoes were the problem. The tomatoes were also the solution. The winter evening light in Moscow was the orange-pink of the sodium lamps and the snow. The snow reflected everything. The city's lighting bounced between the orange lamps and the white snow and produced a twilight that was not dark, exactly, but the specific orange-gray of Moscow in winter. The sky at 6 o'clock in February when the sun had been down for 2 hours. Vera walked home from the metro in this light. The walk from the metro station to the building took 5 minutes. In this light, the familiar street was the same and not the same. The sodium lamp at the corner that was not working made a gap in the orange, a dark patch where the snow was blue-white instead of orange, the unlit section of street that the working lamp made more visible by contrast. She had been walking this street for 11 years. She knew every irregularity in the pavement, the crack that held ice, the raised edge where the concrete slabs joined, the section where the snow always drifted deeper because of the building's corner. She knew the street in the way that you know things that your body has memorized without your instruction, automatically, competently, with the full possession that comes from repetition. The street was hers. The building was hers. The kitchen was hers. The desk drawer of the encyclopedia volumes was hers. The library card was hers. None of this was hers in the formal sense. Soviet property arrangements were specific, and the apartment was a state apartment and the street was a state street, and ownership in the Soviet sense was a complicated category. But possession and ownership are not the same thing. She possessed it. It was hers in the sense that mattered, the sense of the life built in it, the days accumulated in it, the self that had formed in this specific geography. The New Year was the celebration. Not Christmas. Christmas was a religious holiday, and the Soviet state had a specific relationship with religious observance that made it, officially, not a state occasion. But the New Year, January 1st, was the Soviet celebration, the tree, the New Year tree, the yolka, identical in appearance and function to a Christmas tree but named differently. The gifts, the special foods, the gathering of families. The New Year table in Vera's apartment was the most elaborate meal of the year. Olivier salad, the Russian salad of potato and vegetable and hard-boiled egg and pickled cucumber and mayonnaise, that was as specific to the Soviet New Year table as the turkey is to the American Thanksgiving, and that Vera made in a large bowl that lasted through the first days of January. Herring under a fur coat, the shuba, the layered salad of herring and potato and beet and carrot and onion and mayonnaise, another of the dishes that defined the Soviet festive table. Mandarin oranges, the New Year oranges, the imported citrus that appeared in the stores in December, and that were associated with the holiday in the specific way that seasonal goods become associated with the moments when they appear. Champagne, the Soviet Sovsko Champansko, the domestic sparkling wine that was drunk at midnight and that tasted, frankly, of the holiday rather than of quality, which was exactly right. The smell of the New Year apartment, the mandarin orange and the salad mayonnaise and the pine of the yucca, was a smell that would remain specific to this era for the people who had lived in it, one of those olfactory memories that carry a whole world inside them. Vera stood at the kitchen counter peeling mandarin oranges on the 31st of December, and the smell was the smell of every 31st of December she had ever known. This was continuity. This was the family persisting through the specific smell of citrus in the kitchen. The letter that Masha's professor had given her, not given her specifically, but that she had understood she was being allowed to read through the mechanism of his library key being left on her desk for a specific afternoon, was 30 pages of typescript. It was a Samizdat text. She had understood this the moment she picked it up. She had read it in 3 hours in the university library, returned it by leaving it in the professor's office as he had indicated, and had said nothing to anyone. The text was a historical analysis. It was careful, documented, specific. It was about the period of collectivization. It said things that the official historiography did not say, with the evidence for why. She had not been shaken by the content of the text. She had already understood in the way that she understood things that the official version was not the complete version. She had been shaken by the experience of reading the evidence, the specificity of it, the actual documented reality of something she had previously understood as a general sense of things being not quite right. The general sense and the specific evidence were different. The specific evidence stayed with you differently. She did not tell Vera immediately. She thought about it for 3 days. Then she told her in the kitchen quietly. The door closed. Vera was quiet for a long moment. "Your professor trusts you," she said finally. "Yes," said Masha. "That's not a small thing," said Vera. "No," said Masha. They were quiet together. The sound of the building's central heating pipes was in the walls. Outside Moscow was February. "Thank you for telling me," Vera said. This was the full conversation. It was also not the full conversation. They both knew this. This was how things were communicated in the kitchen. This was how they always had been. Konstantin's mother had lived through the full history. She was 84, in a nursing home in another district of Moscow, visited by Konstantin every Sunday after the Sunday lunch at home. The second visit of the afternoon, the duty that was also the genuine desire of a son who understood that his mother would not be there much longer, and who had the specifically Soviet understanding of time that comes from living through decades of history, in which things that seemed permanent turned out not to be. His mother had been born before the revolution. She had been a young woman in the 1920s, the era of the new economic policy, the brief experiment with limited market mechanisms that the Bolsheviks permitted before Stalin ended it. She had been in Moscow through the 30s, through the terror, through the war. She had survived. She was not lucid every day. On the days when she was lucid, Konstantin sat with her and she talked about things from a long time ago, and he listened and did not ask questions, because the questions might take her somewhere difficult, and there was no need to take her somewhere difficult when she was 84 and had already been there. On the days when she was not lucid, she held his hand and was quiet, and he sat with her and was quiet, and the room was warm, and the window showed the courtyard of the nursing home, and they were together in the way that you can be together in silence at the far end of a long shared history. He told Vera about these visits in the kitchen, not in detail, in the compressed way of serious things shared between people who have been together long enough to understand the shorthand. She understood the shorthand. She always had. The year turned toward March. The seeds on Pyotr Ivanovich's balcony had germinated. 2 weeks after he had planted them, the first pale green shoots had appeared at the surface of the soil, the specific moment that he had been waiting for since February, the evidence that the process had begun. He went out in the cold and looked at them. They were very small. They were entirely themselves, no ambiguity about what they were, the specific leaf shape of the tomato plant recognizable even at this size. He covered them again with the plastic sheeting. He went inside. He made tea. He sat in his chair with the tea and thought about the shoots, which would become seedlings and then plants and then tomatoes in the high Moscow summer, if everything went as planned, if the sun was sufficient, if no late frost caught them out, if the spring came when it was supposed to. If. There were always ifs. The ifs were not reasons not to start. They were the conditions of the enterprise. You started with the ifs and you did what you could about each one as it arrived. This was how you did anything. This was how you did everything. The metro in the evening was different from the metro in the morning. The morning metro was purposeful, the packed cars full of people going to work, the speed and the compression of it, the collective forward movement. The evening metro was more varied, the same density at rush hour, but mixed with the people who were not going home from work but from other things, the theater audience, the people returning from the shops with their Avoskas full, the students from the university with their bags of books, the older people returning from visits to family. The texture of the evening metro was more particular than the morning's. Vera read in the morning. In the evening she sometimes read and sometimes watched the car. The car was Moscow in cross-section. The demographics of the city represented in one moving space, the worker and the engineer and the student and the pensioner all standing in the same warmth, all heading somewhere. She had a habit, acquired over years of the metro, of trying to guess what people were thinking about, not in any mystical sense, just the game of the observant person in a crowd, the woman with the slightly unfocused eyes who is working through a problem, the man whose expression is the specific expression of someone who has had a good day and knows it, the teenager whose face is the face of someone in the middle of an emotion that they haven't yet found the language for. She was usually wrong. This did not bother her. The game was not about being right. It was about paying attention. Paying attention was the thing. The late night in the apartment had its own quality. After 11, after Masha and Konstantin were asleep, the apartment was hers in the specific way of the hours that belong to the person who is last awake. Not lonely, she was not lonely in her own apartment, but solitary, which is different and which she found in the specific measure of late-night hours restorative. She read, or she sat at the kitchen table and thought, or she did the things that needed doing in quiet, the mending, the small administrative tasks, the planning of the week's food. In these hours she was most herself in the sense of being least managed, least arranged for anyone else's consumption. The self that existed in the kitchen at midnight was the self that did not need to be a teacher or a wife or a mother in the active sense. It was simply whatever she was underneath all of that. She was not sure she could have described what that was. She was not sure she needed to. She was here. The kitchen was here. The building was breathing around her with its heating pipes. The city was outside in the dark. She was sufficient to the life she had. She knew this about herself. It was, she had come to understand, the most important thing she knew about herself. The summer at the Dacha was everything the winter apartment was not. The apartment was dense, organized, managed. The Dacha was sprawling, unmanaged, wild at the edges. The apartment was the city's imposition on private space. The Dacha was private space's assertion of itself. In July, Vera woke without an alarm. The light came early. Moscow summer light begins at 4 in the morning, a quality of light that is almost otherworldly in its gentleness. the pale northern light of the summer solstice that makes a June morning in Moscow look like a painting of a morning rather than an actual morning. She woke in the light and lay still for more than 30 seconds. This was the Dacha's gift, the permission to exceed the morning allowance, and then got up and went outside. The morning at the Dacha, the garden still wet with dew, the tomatoes and cucumbers hanging heavy, the dill grown tall enough to move in the lightest wind. She walked the garden in the early light. She checked what was ready to harvest. She picked what needed to be picked. The picking was not the same as the managing. The picking was pure. The tomato that came off the vine at the precise right moment, warm and heavy, the stem releasing cleanly, this was not a problem to solve. This was a thing that had happened correctly. She put the tomatoes in a basket. She brought them inside. She made breakfast. At the end of the summer, they drove back to Moscow. The car was Konstantin's, a Zhiguli, the Soviet family car that was the workhorse of the Soviet middle class, sturdy in the way that things designed for Soviet conditions needed to be sturdy. The drive took 2 hours. They loaded the trunk with the preserved goods, the jars of pickles and jam and compote, the dried herbs, the last fresh vegetables that wouldn't survive being left at the dacha. The car smelled of cucumber and dill for the entire drive back. Vera sat in the passenger seat and looked at the road. The road from the dacha to Moscow in August was a particular road, the birch forest on either side, the birches going yellow at the edges already, the first intimation of the autumn that was coming. The light was the late August light that always felt valedictory, the light that said, "This is ending, and it is beautiful that it is ending, and you should look at it." She looked at it. She thought, this is the year. This specific iteration of the year, this specific light, this specific weight of the cucumbers in the trunk, this specific version of the children and the husband and herself. Next year she would be a year older. Next year the children would be different. Next year the light would be the same, but she would look at it differently. This year now, the road, the birches, the light. She looked. Vera was not unhappy. This needs to be said directly because the history of the Soviet Union tends toward the narrative of suffering, and the suffering was real, and the injustices were real, and the system's failures were real. All of that is true. And also, Vera was not unhappy. She had a life that was hers in the ways that mattered. The kitchen at midnight, the library on Thursday, the pickled cucumbers in September, the 40 minutes on the metro with the book, the algebra class third period, the Sunday lunch, the August at the dacha, Nina Petrovna and the metro chapter, Masha growing into someone that Vera could respect. Konstantin and his careful coffee and his desk drawer and his Sunday visits to his mother, Pyotr Ivanovich and his tomatoes and the specific completeness of his company. The Soviet system had not given her these things. She had made them, inside the conditions the system provided, with the specific competence that she brought to everything. The system provided conditions. She had made the life. This is the human thing, not just the Soviet thing. Not just the thing of people living under systems they didn't choose. The universal thing, you are given conditions. You make a life. The conditions matter. The making matters more. The alarm would go off at 6:15 tomorrow. She knew this. She had said it. The bread would be cut. The tea would be made. The metro would run. The sodium lamp at the corner would be out. It had been out for 4 weeks now, the requisition moving through its process. The 9th grade class would be at the board with the chalk. The cue at the gastronom would be whatever it was. The Cherny etude upstairs would be practiced on Thursday. Pyotr Ivanovich's seeds would be another day closer to what they were becoming. And underneath all of this, underneath the managed, organized, navigated daily life of the Soviet apartment and the Soviet city and the Soviet system in the year 1975, the thing that had always been there and would always be there, the person who was Vera in the kitchen at midnight, sufficient to herself, looking at the courtyard where the snow was falling in the orange light, not extraordinary, entirely herself. Enough. The music school where Masha had studied as a child was 3 stops on the metro from the apartment. She had gone every Tuesday and Friday from age 7 until age 15. the canvas bag with the music books bouncing against her leg on the platform, the commute that children in Soviet cities made as a matter of course, the small person's version of the adult commute, the metro and the bus and the arrival at the appointed place, the competence that this routine built in a child who had to manage it. Her teacher had been a woman named Lyubov Alexandrovna, a pianist of the old school who had been teaching at this music school for 30 years, and who had the specific authority of someone who has transmitted knowledge longer than most of her students have been alive. She had made Masha practice scales for the first year, just scales, nothing else. Masha had been frustrated. The frustration had not moved Lyubov Alexandrovna. The second year, the Cherny etudes. The third year, the first Bach inventions. By the fourth year, Masha understood what the scales had been for. By the fifth, she was grateful. By the time she stopped at 15 and chose academic work over music, she understood that she had been given something that was not about the piano, that the discipline of the practice, the patience with the repetition, the knowledge that the difficult section would eventually yield, was something she would use forever. Vera had known this. She had not explained it to Masha until Masha was old enough to understand it. This was the correct sequencing. The understanding came after the doing, not before. This was true of most things. The park near the building was covered in snow from November until April. In the other months, the brief, intense Moscow summer that ran from May through August, the park was genuinely beautiful. The birch trees, which were everywhere in Moscow and which were the tree that most characterized the Moscow landscape, went from bare to bud to full leaf in a matter of weeks in the spring, the green arriving almost overnight. The paths were used by everyone. The children on their bicycles, the old men with their dogs, the young couples who had no privacy in the apartments they shared with their parents and who were willing to take the Moscow summer air as a substitute. In February, the park was used by Pyotr Ivanovich and his morning walk. He walked every morning, regardless of the weather, for 45 minutes. This had begun as doctor's advice and had become a practice with its own justification. He walked along the cleared path that the city kept cleared of snow through the park, and he thought, and he observed, and he was in the particular state of the mind that movement produces, the thinking that happens when you are not sitting still to think. He thought about engineering. He thought about his wife who had died 12 years ago. He thought about the balcony tomatoes. He thought about his son who lived in Leningrad and called twice a month, which was the right amount, neither too much nor too little, the correct calibration of filial duty and separate adult life. He thought about the things he had seen and survived. He did not think about what came next. At 68, he had learned to be present in the specific way that requires not looking ahead. The path, the snow, the birches, the cold, the 45 minutes, then tea, then the balcony, then the day. The system was going to change. Everyone at the kitchen table level knew this, in the way that people know things they cannot say with certainty and whose timeline they cannot predict. The system was going to change because the system always changed, because no human arrangement is permanent, because the specific contradictions of the Soviet system in 1975, the gap between ideology and reality, between what the system claimed and what it delivered, between the private self and the public self, were not stable contradictions. Vera and Konstantin did not discuss this explicitly. They lived with it as a background awareness, the sense that the ground was not permanent. Konstantin, with his engineer's training, thought about it in structural terms. A structure with too many internal stresses eventually fails. Vera, with her mathematician's training, thought about it in terms of systems. A system with too many unpayable debts eventually resolves. They did not know when. They did not know how. They continued their lives. This is what people do. This is perhaps all that people can do. Continue the life, maintain the network, grow the tomatoes, pay attention to the passing of the day. The history that happens to you is not the history you made. The history you made is smaller and more specific. The child taught, the bread eaten, the kitchen table, the morning tea. That history also matters. That history is the one that lives in the body, that goes with you, that is yours. The last thing Vera did each night was check the door. Not a rational check. The door of the apartment was locked, and she knew it was locked, and the building had its street door, and Moscow was not the kind of city where the locked door was insufficient. But the check was a ritual, the hand on the lock confirming the lock's reality, the brief assurance that the boundary between the apartment and the outside was secure. Then she went to the bedroom. Konstantin was asleep. She could hear his breathing in the dark. She found the edge of the bed with her hand and got in carefully, the practiced economy of not waking the person who was already asleep. She lay still. Outside Moscow in February, the snow on the courtyard, the sodium lamp and its orange. The building settling, the pipes, the child upstairs long since asleep, the churny etude waiting for Thursday, Pyotr Ivanovich's seeds on the balcony one floor up in their plastic sheeting in the dark, growing, invisibly, already themselves. She thought about the Trifonov novel, about the day, about Masha and the professor's key, about the sausages, about the sodium lamp that had been out for 4 weeks, about the first cup of tea in the morning. She would set the alarm for 6:15. She would lie still for 30 seconds. She would begin. This was the thing, not the system, not the history, not the official version or the unofficial one. The alarm, the 30 seconds, the kitchen, the tea, the beginning again. Every day the beginning again. The language of Soviet daily life was its own language. Not just Russian, though Russian was the language of official Soviet life, imposed as the language of the Union across its 15 republics in ways that were sometimes smooth and sometimes not. But the specific vernacular of Soviet life, the words and phrases and concepts that existed only in that context, that described realities for which the outside world had no exact equivalents. The Blat, the informal network that we have already discussed. The deficit, the deficit, the shortage, used as a noun to describe not just the state of shortage but the object that was in short supply. Do you know where to get deficit? Being the question that organized a significant portion of Soviet social interaction. The propiska, the residence permit that tied you to a specific city and whose absence from your documents was a serious and specific problem. The tolkachi, the fixers, the people at enterprises whose job was to navigate the supply system and acquire the inputs that the plan had not delivered, the human solution to the plan's failure to actually provide what it promised. These words had no direct equivalents in other languages because the realities they described had no direct equivalents in other places. This is how language works. It grows to fit the world it inhabits. The Soviet world had produced a Soviet vocabulary. The vocabulary would outlast the world that produced it, in the way that words outlast the things they name, becoming eventually the evidence that the thing existed. Vera thought in this language. She could not have said where her private self ended and the Soviet self began, because the language that organized her thinking was the same language that the system had shaped. This is the deepest way a system shapes you, not by telling you what to think, but by giving you the vocabulary in which you think. She had made something of her own within that vocabulary. This was what she had done. This was what everyone she knew had done. You take the vocabulary you are given and you build with it what you can. The schoolchildren in Vera's class were going to inherit a world she could not fully predict. Masha was 19 and was already partly in that future world, the generation that was growing up with the specific texture of the 1970s Soviet Union, which was different from the texture of the 1950s and 1960s that Vera had grown up with. The schoolchildren in the 9th grade were 14. They would be adults in the 1980s. What the 1980s would bring, she genuinely did not know. She taught them algebra. She taught them to think in terms of variables and functions and the relationship between quantities. She taught them to solve problems by identifying the structure of the problem before attempting the solution. This was the most transferable skill she had. Whatever the 1980s brought, the ability to see the structure of a problem before attempting to solve it was going to be useful. She was not a revolutionary. She was not a dissident. She was a mathematics teacher in a Soviet school who was trying to give her students something that would serve them after she was gone. This was modest. This was important. Most of the important things are modest. February became March. Not all at once. February became March gradually, the way the seasons change in Moscow, the cold persisting, the light increasing, the specific quality of March light beginning to enter brighter than February light, carrying something in it that February light does not carry, the thing that light carries when the year is turning. The seeds on Pyotr Ivanovich's balcony were now visible seedlings, small but definite, the first true leaves appearing above the seed leaves. He had thinned them, the painful but necessary process of removing the weaker seedlings so that the stronger ones had room to develop. He did this with the same systematic approach he had brought to engineering problems. Assess the situation honestly, make the decision that the situation requires, implement without sentiment. He had been a good engineer partly for these reasons. He was a good tomato grower for the same reasons. The skills were transferable. Most skills were transferable if you looked at what the skill actually was beneath its specific application. He put the thinned seedlings in the compost. He covered the survivors with the plastic sheeting. He went inside and made tea. He sat in his chair. The building was around him. Vera and Konstantin and Masha were below. The courtyard was outside. The park was a 10-minute walk. Moscow was the city it was doing what it did. He was here. The seedlings were here. March was beginning. This was sufficient. This was, he had decided many years ago, sufficient. The morning tea was not a small thing. It was the first decision of the day, the warmth chosen before warmth was required by anything other than the self. The cup held in both hands. The courtyard in the sodium light. The 30 seconds extended by 2 minutes because it was Wednesday and Wednesday was manageable. In the Soviet apartment of 1975, this was a form of sovereignty. The state managed so much. The state did not manage the 2 minutes with the tea. We think of resistance as large, as public, as declared. The kitchen table suggests otherwise. The kitchen table has always suggested otherwise. In every era, in every system, in every set of conditions that the world has arranged for the people living in it, the kitchen table and the cup, and the 2 minutes before anyone needs anything. This is the thing that persists, not the system, the tea, not the managed version of the life, the kitchen and the cup and the light before the day begins. The algebra of daily life was its own subject, not the algebra on the blackboard, though that algebra was real, and Vera taught it with the conviction of someone who believed that the structures of mathematics described something true about how the world was organized. The algebra of daily life, the variables, the quantities, the relationships between them that you solved for, the unknowns that you navigated around. X was the grain supply. Y was the queue at the Gastronom. Z was what you could make of X and Y together. X was the system's restrictions. Y was the network, the Blat, the people you knew and trusted. Z was the actual life you lived. The mathematician solves for Z. You don't always know X and Y with precision. You estimate, you adjust. You recalculate when new information arrives. You do not stop solving because the problem is imperfect. The problem is always imperfect. The imperfection is the condition of the problem. The condition is not a reason to stop. Vera had taught this to hundreds of children. She had not taught it as life advice. She had taught it as algebra. The children who understood it as algebra were also, without knowing it, being taught life advice. This is how the best teaching works, not by saying the thing directly, by building the structures in which the thing becomes obvious. The courtyard held one more thing that mattered. In the middle of the courtyard, between the playground equipment and the wooden benches, there was a small tree, a birch, planted when the building was built in 1968, now 7 years old, taller than the playground equipment, its bark white and papery in the winter, its branches bare against the February sky. No one had planted it for Vera. No one had planted it for Pyotr Ivanovich. No one had planted it for the children who sledded past it in winter. Someone, the building project's landscaping requirement, the plan specification of 1 tree per courtyard, had planted it, and then the plan had moved on and the tree had stayed and grown. It would be there after the plan was gone. It would be there after the building's residents had moved on. It would be there after the sodium lamp was finally replaced. The birch, growing in the courtyard without instruction, doing what birches do. Some things persist because they are tended. Some things persist because they are inherently themselves, and being themselves is sufficient to continue. The birch did not need to be the largest tree. It did not need to be noticed. It needed only to be a birch in the courtyard in the light, doing the slow, patient work of becoming what it was already. This is also sufficient. This is also, in its way, everything. You are in your bed. The Moscow winter is not outside your window. The queue at the Gastronom is not your Tuesday afternoon. You have not carried the Avoska just in case. You have not calibrated your words to the level of trust in the room. And yet, the kitchen table at 6 in the morning, the cup of tea before the day asks anything of you. This is Vera's kitchen. This is every kitchen where someone has sat for 30 seconds of quiet before the obligations begin. The specific skill of navigating a system that doesn't quite work, of knowing which day the good things come in, of maintaining the network of people who have what you need and who need what you have. This is the Avoska in your pocket. Whatever system you are navigating, whatever shortages are yours, the Avoska is still there, still ready, just in case. The tomatoes on the balcony, the seeds in February, the attention paid to something fragile as an argument for its importance. This is Pyotr Ivanovich. He is in every person who has found in the confined space of their particular conditions the one small thing they can tend: sleep well. And that for tonight is Soviet Moscow, not the Kremlin, not the generals, not the history that was made in conference rooms and at press releases and on foreign stages, but the alarm at 6:15, the kitchen in February, the queue for sausages, the seeds on the south-facing balcony, Masha with her calibrated opinions and her mother's good instinct, Konstantin and his careful coffee, Vera reading on the metro, Pyotr Ivanovich and his seeds. If you've made it this far, leave a comment. Tell me where you listened from. Tell me which of them stayed with you. The subscribe button is nearby if this is your kind of history. Somewhere out there, it's always 3 in the morning. Good night.